I was saying that while we were talking about belief in God. It's like, this is a very complicated topic, right? Do you believe in a transcendent reality? See, okay, now let's say you buy the argument I just made on the natural front. And you say, yeah, that's just nature. That's not God. And then I'd say, well, what makes you think you know what nature is? Like, see, the problem with that argument is that it already presumes a reductionist, materialist, objective view of what constitutes nature. But if you're a scientist, you're going to think, well, in the final analysis, I don't know what nature is. I certainly don't know its origin or destination point. I don't know its teleology. I'm really ignorant about nature. And so when I say it's nothing but nature, I shouldn't mean it's nothing but what I understand nature to be. So I could say, will we have a fully reductionist account of cognitive processes? And the answer to that is yes, but by the time we do that, our understanding of matter will have transformed so much that what we think of as reductionist now won't look anything like what we think of reductionism now. Matter isn't dead dust. I don't know what it is. I have no idea what it is. Matter is what matters. There's a definition. That's a very weird definition. But the notion that we have, that if you're a reductionist, a materialist reductionist, that you can reduce the complexity of what is to your assumptions about the nature of matter, that's not a scientific
Your
proposition.
specific limited human assumptions of this century, of this week, so in some sense, without God in this complicated big definition we're talking about, there's no humility, or
There's not enough.
There's less likely to be, or rather science can err in taking a trajectory away from humility.
Well,
without something much more powerful than an individual human.
Yeah, well then, and we know, the Frankenstein story comes out of that instantly. And that's a good story for the current times. It's like, you're playing around with making new life. You bloody well better make sure you have your arrows pointed up.
And it's interesting because you said science has an ethic to it.
Mm-hmm.
I think
it's embedded in an ethic.
Well, there's science is a big word.
Yeah.
And it includes a lot of disciplines that have different traditions. So biology, chemistry, genetics, physics, those are very different communities. And I think biology, especially when you get closer and closer to medicine and to the human body, does have a very serious, first of all, it has a history with Nazi Germany of being abused and all those kinds of things, but it has a history of taking this stuff seriously. Mm-hmm. What doesn't have a history of taking this stuff seriously is robotics and artificial intelligence, which is really interesting because you don't, you called me a scientist, but,
mm-hmm.
And I would like to wear that label proudly, but often people don't think of computer science as a science, but nevertheless, it will be, I think, the science of one of the major scientific fields of the 21st century, and you should take that very seriously. Oftentimes when people build robots or AI systems, they think of them as toys to tinker with. Oh, isn't this cool?
Mm-hmm. Well,
and I feel this too. Isn't
mm-hmm.
this cool?
It is cool.
But, at a certain moment, you might, isn't this nuclear explosion cool?
Yeah.
Because it is.
Or birth control pill cool. It's like, or transistor cool. Yeah. Well, the other thing too, and this is a weird problem in some sense, the robotics engineer types, they're thing people, right? I mean, the big classes of interest are interest in things versus interest in people.
Some of my best friends are thing people.
Yeah, right. And thing people are very, very clear, logical thinkers, and they're very outcome-oriented and practical. Now, and that's all good. That makes the machinery and keeps it functioning. But there's a human side of the equation. And you get the extreme thing people, and you think, yeah, well, what about the human here? And when we've been talking about the necessity of having a technological enterprise embedded in an ethic, and you can ignore that, like most of the time, right? You can ignore the overall ethic in some sense when you're toying around with your toys. But when you're building an artificial intelligence, it's like, well, that's not a toy. That might be,
A toy becomes the monster very quickly.
yes. And this is a whole new kind of monster.
So if death every single day is the way to progress through life, you have become quite famous.
Death and hell.
Death and hell.
Yeah, because you don't want to forget the hell part.
Do you worry that your fame traps you into the person that you were before?
Yeah, well,
That
even
it
Elvis
makes-
became an Elvis impersonator by the time he died.
Yeah. Do you fear that you have become a Jordan Peterson impersonator? Do you fear of, in some part, becoming the famous suit-wearing, brilliant Jordan Peterson? The certainty in the pursuit of truth, always right.
I think I worry about it more than anything else. I hope I do. I better.
Has fame to some degree, when you look at yourself in the mirror, in the quiet of your mind, has it corrupted you?
No doubt, in some regard. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to avoid, because things change around you. People are much more likely to do what you ask, for example, right? And so that's a danger, because one of the things that keeps you dying properly is that people push back against you optimally. This is why so many celebrities spiral out of control, especially the tyrannical types that, say, run countries. Everyone around them stops saying, yeah, you're deviating a little bit there. They laugh at all their jokes. They open all their doors. They always want something from them. The red carpet's always rolled out. It's like, well, you think, wouldn't that be lovely? It's, well, not if the red carpet is rolled out to you while you're on your way to perdition. That's not a good deal. You just get there more efficiently. And so one of the things that I've tried to learn to manage is to have people around me all the time who are critics and who are saying, yeah, I could have done that better, and you're a little too harsh there, and you're alienating people unnecessarily there, and you should have done some more background work there. And I think the responsibility attendant upon that increases as your influence increases. And as your influence increases, then that becomes a lot of responsibility.
Sometimes
Right.
you can become deeply cynical about the world. If it's the Nietzsche thing,
Yeah.
battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster.
Yeah.
And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you.
Right. But I would say, bring it on. Right? Because that's by also saying, knowing that he's absolutely right. But if you gaze into the abyss long enough, you see the light, not the darkness.
Are you sure about that?
I'm betting my life on it.
Yeah, that's a heck of a bet.
Well, that's
Because it might distort your mind to where all you see
is abyss.
is abyss,
Yeah.
is the evil in this world.
Well, then I would say you haven't looked long enough. That's back to
you're just a limited
the swords, the flaming swords. It's like, so I said the whole story of Christ was prefigured in that image. It's like the story of Christ psychologically is radical acceptance of the worst possible tragedy. That's what it means. That's what the crucifix means. Psychologically, it's like gaze upon that which you are most afraid of. But that story doesn't end there, because in the story, Christ goes through death into hell. So death isn't enough. The abyss of innocent death is not sufficient to produce redemption. It has to be a voluntary journey to hell. And maybe that's true for everyone. And that's like, there is no more terrifying idea than that, by definition. And so then, well, do you gaze upon that? Well, who knows? Who knows?
How often do you gaze upon death, your own? How often do you remind yourself that this ride ends?
Personally?
Personally.
All the time.
Because you, as a deep thinker and philosopher, it's easy to start philosophizing and forgetting that you might die today.
The angel of death sits on every word. How's that?
How often do you actually consciously
All the time.
Notice the angel?
All the time. I think it's one of the things that made me peculiar. When I was in graduate school, I thought about, I I had the thought of death in my mind all the time. And I noticed that many of the people that I was with, these were people I admired fine. That wasn't part of their character, but it was definitely part of mine. I'd wake up every morning. This happened for years. Think, time's short, get at it. Time's short, get at it. There's things to do. And so that was always, it's still there. And it's still there with, I would say, and it's unbearable in some sense. I'm more afraid of hell than death.
You're afraid of the thing that follows.
I don't know if it follows or if it's always here. And I think we're going to find out.
What's the connection between death and hell?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
Is there something that needs to be done before you arrive?
You're more likely to die terribly if you live in a manner that brings you to hell. That's one connection.
And terribly is a very deep kind of concept. Okay.
Yeah. And the problem, right? Yeah. So René Girard believed that it was a human proclivity to demonize the scapegoat and then drive it out of the village. And I've thought about that a lot. We need a place to put Satan. Like, seriously, this is a serious issue.
Should he be inside the village or outside?
Well, maybe he should be inside you. Right? That's the fundamental essence of the Christian doctrine. It's like Satan is best fought on the battleground of your soul. And that's right. It's right.
Can you actually put words to the kind of dragon that you're fighting? Is it communism?
It's the spirit of Cain. Yeah.
Can you elaborate?
Well,
what the spirit of Cain is?
So, after Adam and Eve are thrown out of paradise for becoming self-conscious, or when they become self-conscious, they're destined to work. And the reason for that, as far as I can tell, is that to become self-conscious is to become aware of the future. It's to become aware of death. That certainly happens in the Adam and Eve story. To have the scales fall from your eyes. And then the consequence of that is that you now have to labor to prevent the catastrophes of the future. That's work. Work is sacrifice. Sacrifice of the present to the future. It's delay of gratification. It's maturity. It's sacrifice to something as well, and in the spirit of something. Okay, so now Adam and Eve have two children, Cain and Abel. So those are the first two people in history, because the Garden of Eden doesn't count. And they're the first two people who are born rather than created. So they're the first two people. And that's a hell of a story, because it's a story of fratricidal murder that degenerates into genocide, flood, and tyranny. So that's fun for the opening salvo of the story, let's say. And Abel and Cain both make sacrifices. And for some reason, Abel's sacrifices please God. It's not exactly clear why. And Cain's don't. Now, there's an implication in the text that it's because Cain's sacrifices are second rate. God says that Abel brings the finest to the sacrificial altar. He doesn't say that about Cain. So you could imagine that Cain is sacrificing away, but he's holding something in reserve. He's not all in. He's not bringing his best to the table. He's not offering his best to God. And so Abel thrives like mad. And everyone loves him. And he gets exactly what he needs and wants, exactly when he needs and wants it. He's favored of God. And Cain is bearing this terrible burden forward and working, and his sacrifices are rejected. So he gets resentful, really resentful enough to call God out and say something like, "This is quite the creation you've got going here. I'm breaking myself in half and nothing good's coming my way. What the hell's up with that?" And then there's Abel, the sun's shining on him every day. "How dare you?" It's like, okay, but this is God that Cain's talking to. And so God says what Cain least wants to hear, which is what God usually says to people. He says, "Look to your own devices. You're not making the sacrifices you should, and you know it." And then he says something even worse. He says, "Sin. crouches at your door like a sexually aroused predatory animal. And you've invited it in to have your way, to have its way with you. And so he basically says, you have allowed your resentment to preoccupy yourself, and now you're brooding upon it and generating something creative, new, and awful, possessed by the spirit of resentment. And that's why you're in the miserable state you're in. So then Cain leaves, his countenance falls, as you might expect. And Cain leaves, and he's so incensed by this because God has said, look, your problems are of your own making. And not only that, you invited them in. And not only that, you engaged in this creatively. And not only that, you're blaming it on me. And not only that, that's making you jealous of Abel, who's your actual idol and goal. And Cain, instead of changing, kills Abel. Right? And then Cain's descendants are the first people who make weapons of war. And so that's, okay, you want to know what I think? That's the eternal story of mankind. And it's playing out right now.